Okay, everybody, what's going on? Alright, I think we're all good. Hello, everybody, this is, well, you know who I am. It says it on the channel, right? But anyways, this is Daniel Rogers with LaborNotInVain.com. So glad that you're with me today. Hopefully people will trickle in as the night progresses. As you see the title of the lesson, we're going to be discussing they will hand him over. We're going to talk about who the they is. We're going to talk about who they're handing him over to. And then we're going to talk about the implications of that. Alright? So that's the plan today. They will hand him over. This is in Matthew chapter 20, verse 17 through 19. The scripture says this. As Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves, and on the way he said to them, Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Alright, chief priests and scribes, who we got here? Well, that's Jews, right? Jews, right? The descendants of Isaac, the descendants of Jacob, of the tribe of Judah and of the tribe of Benjamin. Here they are. They're going to condemn Jesus to death. But then you have the second group, verse 19. And they will hand him over to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him. And on the third day he will be raised up. Now, so they're taking him from the Jews, handing him to the non-Jews, that is, the Gentiles. These are the foreigners. These are the people of the Roman military. And they're going to be taking Jesus, and they're going to scourge him, and they're going to mock him. And then one of those soldiers is going to reach up and pierce him in the side with a spear. Okay? And so you have the Jews involved in this, and you also have the non-Jews involved in this. Alright? The cool thing about this, though, is that Jesus would extend grace not just to the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the people who shouted, crucify him. But he would also extend grace and peace and love and mercy to this second group. This group called the Gentiles that would take him up and that would scourge him and that would mock him and that would eventually crucify him. Both parties participate in the sacrifice of Jesus, and it is to both parties that God offers his grace and his mercy through the gospel of Christ. And that's exactly what we come to in Romans chapter 4. In Romans chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, Paul says this, What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, is found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him. It was imputed to him as righteousness. Now he goes on to say this. Now to the one who works, his wage is not credited as a favor, but what is due. So think about this. The younger son in the prodigal son story in Luke chapter 15 that Jesus tells. The younger son, he takes what is his and he runs with it, basically telling his father, I wish you were dead. Basically telling his father, you're as worth to me as much as your money is. So you give me all your money and I'm a split. Now the older brother, his idea of his father was kind of on the other side. He said to his father, you know, I've been laboring every day for you. I've never broken one of your commands. Okay, well, the reward that he was seeking was not one of grace. The father was a graceful father. He wanted to offer rewards based on grace and not based on merit. And so what he says here in Romans chapter 4 is, now to the one who works, his wage is not credited as a favor, but what is due. Now to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Here we have a case of an ellipsis in verse 5. He's not saying that you should try not to work in order that you can get more grace. What he's saying is, instead of focusing on your obedience, so much more focus on your faith. He's emphasizing the faith as opposed to the works here. And so he says, but the one who believes in him and justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. So we have this blessing of the credited, as faith being credited as righteousness. And I brought up at the very beginning, who is this, who is going to receive the blessings of this covenant, so to speak? Well, we learned in Matthew chapter 20 that there were two parties there that were instrumental in the crucifixion of Jesus. The Jews had him first, and they turned over to the non-Jews, the foreigners, the Gentiles, those who were occupying Jerusalem. Their rulers, they're the ones that they were subject to, okay? And I mentioned how God's going to extend grace to both of those, and that's what we find in verse 9. He says, "Is this blessing then on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised also?" So he says, "For we say, faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness." So you have this group, the circumcised and the uncircumcised. Now, we can identify who these groups are relatively quickly. In Galatians chapter 2, we have an individual named Titus. And Titus was not compelled to be circumcised. See Galatians chapter 2 and verses 1 and following. Why wasn't he compelled to be circumcised? Because he was a Greek. In other words, he was one of these foreigners. He was one of these non-Jews. Now, the thing about this is that in the book of Acts, Paul takes Timothy and he circumcises Timothy. Now, why does he do that? Timothy was half Greek, but he was also the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer. And so he needs to be circumcised, because anyone of the descendants of the tribes of Israel is bound to this covenant of circumcision, and they're bound to keep the whole law, because Paul did say whoever is circumcised is bound to keep the whole law. Now, Titus is not bound to keep the law, and Titus is not bound to be circumcised because he is a Greek. Timothy, on the other hand, he was not a Greek. He was half Greek and half Jewish, and so he himself was bound to keep the law and therefore bound to be circumcised. So you have this contrast between the Jew and the Greek. This is very easy to see, and it's something that's actually the fulfillment of many Old Testament prophecies. So when you look at Romans chapter 4, Paul says you have these that are to be circumcised and you have these that are not to be circumcised, but both of them have their faith credited as righteousness, as we see in verse 9, to them, not based upon their works, but based upon their faith. Hey, Sebo 3. Hey, Sebo, how you doing today? Thanks for joining me. And so in Jesus' crucifixion, Matthew 20 describes he was delivered to the Gentiles by the Jews. Both groups active in the crucifixion of Jesus, both groups receiving grace through that crucifixion and by that crucifixion on behalf of their faith, something that they appropriated through faith. If we move down to verse 16, the scripture says, "For this reason it is by faith, in order that may be in accordance with grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law," i.e., Jerusalem and rather the Jews and the northern tribes, but also to those who are faith by Abraham, who is the father of us all. And he goes and he clarifies here, "For it is written, a father of many nations have I made you, in the presence of him whom ye believe God, even God who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist." And so we have embedded in the very promise given to Abraham that he would be a father of many nations, not just of one nation, but many, of the Jews and also the Greeks, of Israel and also the foreigners. This is seen in Jesus' crucifixion, and this is seen in the ministry of Paul, and it's especially seen in Old Testament prophecy as well. Sorry you're feeling bad, Sebo. Hope you get feeling better shortly. That's always a sad thing. I'm sweating a little bit. That's just because it's hot and I went on a walk, but whatever. Okay, Isaiah 49:6 says this. He says, "It is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also make." So you have this whole idea of the restoration of Israel, but you also have this idea of being a light to the nations so that salvation would reach to the ends of the earth. This is something that was embedded all those years ago and the promise made to Abram, that through your seed all nations will be blessed. Okay? And it would be on the basis of faith and not by the basis of natural birth that these children would come about. And that is that there is in the record for the shortest stream you've ever heard right here on this channel. But hey, listen, I've got to go pick up Laura from school. I was just doing this until she popped in and had me go get her. So time to go pick up Laura. Thank you for joining me today. Hope you enjoyed this very short stream, very short stream, very short point, but an important one, and one that is sadly missed by a lot of folks. Hope you have a great day, and God bless.